The cartoon is based on a couplet by Ogden Nash. The rain, it raineth every day on the rich and on the poor fella. But the poor get wetter than the rich because the rich has poor's umbrella. And I think that captures exactly what is happening with climate change and with the problem of equity. I'd like to take us through the debates both on the issue of international equity and on the issue of domestic equity. So let me quickly begin with an overview of the Paris Agreement. And those of you who have followed the discussions in the newspapers, in commentaries, in blogs, etc., would know that the Paris Agreement was broadly welcomed by virtually everybody, by of course all governments, but even surprisingly by a large number of civil society organizations. Those big international NGOs and others who have been at the forefront of the discussions on climate change have also broadly welcomed the Paris Agreement. My own view is that the good thing about the Paris Agreement is that 195 countries have agreed on the fact of man-made climate change, the governments of these countries. So it's no longer going to be easy for any government to take a climate denial position. Trump may do it, but it's going to be difficult for governments to do so because governments have gone on record now to say, yeah, we recognize man-made climate change. The second is that some binding national targets have actually been set at Paris through the medium of these voluntary pledges by various countries. Now, I am not a woolly-eyed optimist to think that this marks a great victory. I fully understand the limitations of both these, the fact that governments have agreed and the fact that countries have pledged to do various things. But I believe that it at least gives the rest of us a platform for continuing struggle. There is something on the basis of which you can start the struggle and say, look, you guys have committed to this. So let's start with that. I'm going to hold your feet to the fire and let's go to the next step. The Paris Agreement, in my view, is not good from three main points of view. The first is the global agreement, the Paris Agreement's goal is to limit the impact of climate change to keep global average surface temperature rise to a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, the wordings of the Paris Agreement are actually more ambitious. It says well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to the extent possible, we will aim at 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is new, this ambitious statement of a goal in the run-up to Paris at previous COPs in Cancun and Durban, etc. There was only a hint of looking even beyond 2 degrees. See, Paris Agreement formally states we'll go well beyond 2 degrees and look at 1.5. But all the INDCs which different countries have pledged, different countries have said we will cut our emissions by so much. If you add all those up together, it comes nowhere near 2 degrees. If all countries reduce their emissions by as much as they have said they would, we are still looking at 3 to 3.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. There is a gap between what has been pledged and what is required to meet a 2 degrees Celsius goal in terms of emission reductions. On top of what has been pledged by different countries, you still need to reduce global emissions by somewhere between 12 to 15 gigatons, that's a billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, you need to reduce by that much if you want to meet 2 degrees Celsius. Various things could have been done in Paris to try and achieve this, but the very framework of the Paris Agreement was, and one of the supposedly methods which have assured the success of the Paris Summit was, unlike the earlier Kyoto Protocol, which set a top-down target and prescribed every country, developed country, must reduce its emissions from 1990 levels. It should be minus 5.6% by the year 2008. That is a flat target set. Argument by the US in particular and by most developed countries is this top-down target didn't work in Kyoto. So this time, let us do a voluntary bottom-up target. We will not set a target for everybody. Let everybody set their own targets. So the US said, I will do so much. The European Union says, I will do so much. XYZ said, I will do so much. So because these are all voluntary pledges, therefore the idea is that you are more likely to obey and to follow that rather than a target set by somebody else from above. To my mind, very flawed architecture for the Paris Agreement. I like to use a cricket analogy, which I hope those of you who don't follow cricket would be able to follow. And that is, if you've got a one-day match in cricket and the team that has batted first has scored 250 runs, the team batting second aims to cross 250 runs. It's certainly not helpful if the team that's batting second, the opening batsman says, I'll score 20. This guy who comes second says, I'll score 22. Third guy says, I'll score 30, but the total comes up to only 200. You must know what the target is, and you must have a team effort to cross that. What we have done is to do this. Every chap has put up his hand and said, I'll do so much, and there is no third empire, body, group, captain, manager, who will see, does this total up to the goal that you want? It doesn't. And that's a big problem with the pledge and review system, but that's what we have got. At the heart of the architecture set by the Paris Agreement is that it is a deeply inequitable agreement. And I'll explain why. The first and most important part of this is the Paris Agreement ignores what are called historical emissions, that is, emissions which have already gone before. Climate change is caused by the accumulation of greenhouse gases, mainly carbon dioxide, but also methane, CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, nitrous oxides, primarily carbon dioxide, since the dawn of the industrial era. You can say from 1850 onwards is taken as a baseline. Who has put all these gases there? India was not an industrial power in 1850. China was not an industrial power in 1850. Who were the industrial powers in 1850? The British, the Germans, the French, the Europeans in general, and the Americans. They had steam factory-driven factories. They had steam ships going all over the world. They had steam engines transporting goods. They were the guys who were causing this explosion in carbon dioxide. And we know today that 77% of the blanket of carbon dioxide that we have got surrounding the earth has been put there by the developed countries since 1850 to date. The Kyoto Protocol takes this into account. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the foundation of all these discussions, says because there has been this long history of pollution which has resulted in this blanket of carbon dioxide which is causing climate change, following the well-established principle in international law and of ethics internationally, and that's the principle that the polluter pays. He who has polluted pays for the damage or is responsible for the problem and therefore is responsible for its solution. By ignoring historical emissions, the Paris Agreement has therefore said what has happened in the last 170 years, let's just forget about it, and now let us look at the future. So the 77% of carbon dioxide which has been put there by the developed countries is already there. Forget that. Now just let's look forward. And as I'm fond of saying, and then you sort of argue, India is a huge country, growing, high GDP growth rate, China is like this. So let's look for a fair solution, and the fair solution the Americans and the Europeans would like to put forward is, let's be fair, you also reduce, we also reduce. But like I say, this is like the fat guy who has eaten all the food available and the thin guy who has not eaten much of the food all this time are today left with a situation where there is very little food left. And the fat guy says, let's be fair, you also reduce your intake by half, I'll also reduce my intake by half. So the fat guy will become lean and fit and the thin guy will die. This is the framework of the Paris Agreement which we are left with today, which is the implication of ignoring the past. If you're only looking forward and then saying you also cut, I also cut, this puts an uneven emphasis and burden of the responsibility onto the shoulders of the developing countries. So it deals only with the future emissions. It avoids the very deep cuts by the industrialized countries, which has been called for by the science. Successive reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said, because the developed countries are responsible for 80% of the problem, they should take responsibility for proportionately, let's say 80% of the solution going forward and make very deep cuts in their emissions going forward. Maybe by as much as 90 to 95% by the middle of this century, they should reduce their emissions. The emission cuts promised by the developed countries goes nowhere near that number. In fact, today, the developing countries together, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, a group of 20 large developing countries put together, the cuts promised by them in absolute terms amounts to about 2.5 times the emissions reductions promised by the developed countries. Clearly, this is highly unequal. A problem caused by the developed countries, the bulk of the solution is being put forward by the developing countries for a problem caused by the developed nations. The second thing is this promise of 1.5 degrees Celsius or well under 2 degrees. If the above problem that we have just talked about is already there with a goal of 2 degrees, tomorrow if a goal of 1.5 degrees, then more cuts are called for. And who is going to make these cuts? If already the greater proportion is falling on the shoulders of India and China and others, it stands to reason that if you're going to aim at 1.5, even more pressure will be put on China and India to take on more burden, saying, please, unless you do it, the world's going to collapse. So you have to do this. The numbers given by the fifth assessment report of the IPCC tell us we can look at this problem in terms of a global carbon budget. That is to say, the atmosphere as a whole can hold a finite amount of carbon dioxide. That's all it can hold if you want temperature not to cross 2 degrees Celsius. To meet that carbon budget, from the beginning till now, a total budget of 3,000 gigatons, billion tons of carbon dioxide was available from 1850 onwards. Out of that, 2,000 has already been used up. So we are left with a balance of 1,000 gigatons. If you take all the INDCs which have been pledged by the different countries, that already totals up to 750. So we are left with a budget of 250 gigatons to play with in the future, which has to be divided between US, Europe, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, etc., 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 out of which then each country will be told you only have so much left. Now imagine if India, with all its necessities for the future, needs to do building of infrastructure, poverty alleviation, provisioning of health, all this will require energy. If you expend that energy, you're likely to emit carbon dioxide, but you're being told now, America has done what it has to do, Europe has done what it has to do, they will reduce. But India, you must now tighten your belt. We already have no notches left in our belt to tighten, but in the future, looking forward, you have very little what I will call carbon space. Now, I'd like to quickly come to India's position at the Paris Agreement and what that tells us about the commitment that India has made in Paris, the INDC that India has put forward. As you all know, India has, right from the beginning of the negotiations in the UN Framework Convention from Rio 1990s, early 90s onwards, India had rightly pointed to the fact that if you have to have a discussion on how to control emissions, who is to do how much, then this can only be done by using as a metric, as a measure, the idea of emissions per capita, per person. That is to say, you take the world as a whole and you say, this is the total carbon space available in the atmosphere. So per person, whether he's in America or Europe or in India, is entitled to so much. That's his share. So per capita emissions should be a yardstick or a measure by which you apportion responsibilities. However, over the years, India shifted away from this position. And during the glory years of PM Manmohan Singh and his love affair with the United States, looking for a strategic partnership, etc., you would remember George W. Bush had started convening these G5 meetings, which then became the G8 meetings with the inclusion of Russia and China in them. And then the G8 expanded to G8 plus 5, where at George W.'s insistence, countries like India, South Africa, Brazil were also invited. That became the G8 plus 5, which started being called the Major Economies Forum. So the G5, the G8 used to have its meeting 2 days, and on the third day, India and Brazil and others would come. That would be the Major Economies Forum, which gradually climate activists started calling the Major Emitters Forum, because these were the leading, the countries with the highest emissions in the world. And then this morphed into the G20. India was very enamored with this arrangement. India felt we were finally now sitting at the high table of international diplomacy. You're now playing with the big boys. And in the interests of being admitted to this club of the big boys, we went along with the formulations which were essentially being advanced by the United States on a variety of global issues, including on climate change. And if you will observe, I've written on this extensively elsewhere, the formulations on climate change that shifted the argument from the earlier framework of the Kyoto Protocol to the framework which we now see in the Paris Agreement started shifting from before Copenhagen, got solidified at the Copenhagen summit, and through Cancun, Durban, and finally Paris has got crystallized into the new architecture of the Paris Agreement. So totally different architecture from the Kyoto Protocol, but you will notice key formulations of the Paris Agreement go back to Copenhagen, and all these formulations at Copenhagen were spelt out in the G8+5 and the MEF forum outside of the UN Framework Convention, and essentially at the high table of global diplomacy led by the United States. And therefore, it comes as no surprise that this framework essentially represents what the United States has been pursuing for a long time in climate. You know that the United States first signed on to the Kyoto Agreement and then backed out, was not a member of the Kyoto Protocol, arguing that the US could not accept a framework which had this big differentiation between the developed and the developing countries. So they kept pushing for what they called a single framework, one framework which will govern all the countries, which is what they have got in Paris now, with some differentiation. You do less, I'll do more, a little bit of that, but essentially a single framework with no strict differentiation between the two and with no acceptance of responsibility. The biggest problem of the ignoring of historical emissions is the US does not today face any liability. You can't hold the US now responsible anymore for saying, since 1850, you and other developed countries have been emitting so much carbon dioxide. That is why climate change has been caused, and therefore you owe the developing countries compensation or reparations or some form of recompense for the damage that you have done. Nobody can say that anymore. It's the same argument which big tobacco has been arguing for a long time, saying we can't help it, we didn't know what tobacco would do and what smoking would do and stuff like that way. So we cannot be held responsible for any past actions. It's the same that we have got today. While recognizing that India has moved its position in the international negotiations, we should also recognize that India is caught in a dilemma. What's that dilemma? If you look at all hard indicators, poverty levels, infant mortality levels, maternal mortality levels, education levels, primary healthcare levels, India stands somewhere between 110 to 130 in the list of countries in terms of ranking. If you look at HDI tables and at HDI indicators, India is more or less on par with sub-Saharan Africa. By any objective standards, that's where India stands. But at the same time, India today has got huge GDP growth. India likes to proclaim it's the fastest growing major economy in the world. It's got huge GDP potential, the biggest middle class after China, claims for a seat in the Security Council, wants a place in the sun as a global power, if not as a big regional player. So India is caught between these two. Actually speaking, if you look at all objective indicators, India ranks with the least developed countries. But in terms of its ambitions, in terms of its projections, in terms of its aspirations, it ranks with the top levels of countries of the world. It also ranks among the top countries of the world in terms of emissions. India today is the fourth largest country by emissions in the world. Not surprising given the industrial activities that have taken place and the fact that you are a country of 1.3 billion people. You're going to be to have large emissions. But I think India had not reckoned with, India is in this dilemma. How do we reconcile this dilemma and resolve it in the international arena? How do we reconcile this? I think India missed a big opportunity to reassess its own position from a geopolitical viewpoint. And I think the reason why India missed this opportunity is its eyes were only on the United States. Every position it took, it weighed it by saying, what is the US going to say? George W., what is he going to say when we have dinner with him at the G8 meeting? Whereas till then, India's traditional allies in the UN Framework Convention had been the least developed countries, the island states. We had been arguing on everybody else's behalf. This is what the developing countries need to do, and this is what the developed countries need to do. Suddenly, India had forgotten all those countries and was happy having dinner and confabulations with the US and with the Europeans sitting in the G8 plus 5. As a result of which, over a period of time, the small island states in particular, the least developed countries also, started seeing India as much of a problem as the US and Europe and not as part of the solution. This was further added fuel by the fact that India's position in the international fora at Durban, at Cancun, etc. was, we are a developing country, we don't need to do anything, the problem has been caused by the developed countries, you solve the problem, we have nothing to do. This was not a message you could sell to the world, to the international community, and in particular to the island states and to the least developed countries. As I said, India was already the fourth, if not the third largest emitting nation in the world. You could see India developing rapidly, sitting in the G8 meetings. All the LDCs and the African group and the island nations could see India sitting there with George W. At these meetings. And then for India to say, no, we've got nothing to do with it, we are a poor developing country, was not an argument that India could sell abroad. If you look at those top two figures that you see, the pie chart here, if you look at these here, the chart on the left shows you that the developed countries are responsible for 80% of the emissions up there. Developing countries, including China, 20%. But if you look at the position going forward, the second pie chart there, you will see that developing countries, which is in yellow, are already responsible for 55% of the emissions in the future going forward. And by 2050, this is going to become 75%. This is a reality. This is why the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, released in 2007, which I regard as a watershed in the scientific assessment of the climate change problem, had, while asking for developed countries to make deep cuts in their emissions, had also said that developing countries need to deviate below the baseline in terms of their emissions, meaning we can't make absolute cuts, but we can slow down our increase. Today, India is growing at 4% per annum in emissions. We need not grow at 4, we can maybe grow at 3 and gradually slow down our rate of growth so that sooner or later we start leveling off and then start declining. This is not something that India had taken into account. You will see here our then Minister for the Environment, Jayanti Natarajan, and she is surrounded by leaders of the entire world. For one whole day, the negotiations in Cancun were held up because India refused to sign on the dotted line on the grounds that we will not accept binding emission cuts on India. We will not accept targets for emission cuts. And our friend from Grenada, who was chairing the island nation, said, "What does that mean, India? Does that mean you develop while we drown?" This is what she said. And India was surrounded by developed countries and developing countries, all of whom said India was an obstructionist force because India has been unable to resolve this dilemma in India's position. So, let's cut to Paris and the INDCs themselves. What does India's commitment say in the INDC? The broad headline commitment that India has in its nationally determined contribution is India will reduce the emissions intensity, the intensity of its emissions by between 30 and 35% by the year 2030. This is the commitment that India has made. Two things we need to quickly understand. What is this emissions intensity? It doesn't mean an absolute reduction in emissions. Emissions intensity is a ratio of total emissions divided by the GDP. That is, for each unit of GDP, each $1,000 or $1 million, however you define it, of GDP, how much emissions are you having? So in effect, you're saying our economy will become more energy efficient. If we double our GDP, earlier we would have doubled our emissions, now we will not double them, we will only increase our emissions by 30%, meaning thereby that our economy will become more efficient, energy efficient, by reducing our energy consumption and thereby by reducing energy. Now, how good a target is that? Very briefly, at Copenhagen, we had made a pledge saying we will decline our emissions intensity by 20 to 25% by the year 2020. So if you look at that rate and you look at the rate at which we have said we will reduce at Paris, it's not very different. So it's not as if since Copenhagen, India has got more ambitious that we will make a big commitment. At the same time, India has not gone backwards and reduced its target. To my mind, it's a modest target, doable target, it can be done. And the INDC that India has submitted itself says that in the last decade or so, from 2005 onwards, our emissions intensity has been declining by about 2.5% per annum. Whereas what we are promising now is a decline of only about 1.5% per annum. So we should be able to easily achieve the broad headline target that we have set. And what are of course, the INDC, if you look at the document, it has a whole wish list. We'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this. Some of these wishes have numbers attached to them. The other wishes are just statements saying we will also do this and this will have a positive effect on reducing emissions. The numbers that we have set forth are, one, we have set a hugely ambitious target of renewable energy. That is, we need to make more electricity, but we will not do so by increasing coal-fired power plants, but by increasing solar and wind. Today, solar and wind put together account for about 5% of total energy production, electricity production by India. This government has promised that's about 5,000 plus 7,000 megawatts of electricity generation, solar, wind combined. We have said we will increase this. During Manmohan Singh's government, in the National Action Plan on Climate Change, a target was set of hiking solar to 20,000 megawatts from 5,000 by 2020. That itself was considered a big target. The Modi government has said by 2022, not even by 2030, which is the ceiling set by the INDCs for the Paris Agreement, we will increase solar and wind generation to 175,000 megawatts from 5,000. You just look at the scale at which the expansion is taking place, of which 100,000 megawatts is going to be solar, about 60,000 megawatts is going to be wind, and the others will be biomass and decentralized, etc. 175,000 megawatts. It's a huge jump. Nobody knows how realistic this is, but a promise has been made that this is what India is going to achieve. And in fact, if India actually achieves this target, this headline target of 30 to 33% will actually go up to 41%. We will exceed our INDC target with just this one measure by 2030, because this target is for 2022. So obviously after that also you still got another 8 years to grow. We will discuss later how realistic or otherwise this is, given the fact that till now, since independence, every power generation target that India has announced, we have achieved less than 50% of that. How far we are going to do this, we don't know. At the same time, we must take into account also the fact that internationally, prices of solar power generation are dropping like a stone. Today, setting up a solar power plant and generating solar in terms of installed capacity is not very much more expensive than a coal plant. The problem is installed capacity doesn't translate to electricity delivered in solar, because solar works only 50% of the time. When the sun is out, what do you do at night? So 50% of that installed capacity is dead in any case. So fluctuations there, same with wind. When the wind blows, you will get power. When the wind doesn't blow, you will not get. So installed capacity doesn't translate into delivered electricity. This is another factor to be taken into account. A third factor to be taken into account is from the Modi government's Make in India program, not a single kilo of solar cell raw material is made in this country. So this entire capacity of solar generation is going to be based on imported solar cells, 95% of which is going to come from China. The second major commitment made in the INDC is to increase forest/tree cover to 33%. Please note, forest/tree cover. INDC does not speak of forest cover and does not speak of tree cover. And we all know a bunch of trees does not make a forest. I can plant 20,000 eucalyptus trees in this campus, it will not make for a forest. If I cut down 100 acres of forest and plant equivalent amount of eucalyptus trees somewhere, I have not compensated for the loss of forest. So what does this mean? This 33% forest/tree cover is not at all clear in this. Then there is talk of energy efficiency, in which India has been historically good, not because of climate change arguments, But because India wants to conserve energy, India is a very energy import dependent country. So our steel industry, cement industry have been increasing their efficiencies in order to be competitive in the world. And in steel and cement both, Indian manufacturing sectors are today number 1 and number 2 position in the whole world in terms of how much energy you spend per ton of production. So that we are going to continue, plus all the energy efficiency in appliances, air conditioners, star ratings, and so on. These are the 3 major initiatives. Rest of them is all kinds of stuff. The only one which is emphasized is the industrial corridors, Delhi, Mumbai, and the Calcutta to Amritsar industrial corridors, along which a railway line would be constructed, which will be a dedicated freight corridor. And the INDC talks of a 6% shift of freight transportation from road to rail, which, as you all know, is going to be more efficient. But the INDC makes no such promise about shifting passenger traffic from road to rail, which would have benefited the poor rather than just the industrial class, but which could have been tackled here. So there are some very contrary signals from ongoing programs and some big missed opportunities. The INDCs presented to us an opportunity to look at cross linkages, at what are called co-benefits. If I do this, for example, if I shift 10% of road transport from road to rail for passengers, I achieve energy efficiency, I reduce emissions, I also benefit a huge number of traveling public, particularly the poor. So I get an inclusiveness benefit or an equity dividend. So I get multiple benefits from doing one action. We have missed great opportunities to do similar things, to rethink our developmental pathway, but we have not done that in making out our INDCs. So as I said, the big problem area for me is we have missed out equity. Internationally, India has been the big champion of equity, talking about the big difference between the poor and the rich and the developed and the developing. When it comes to our own country, we are not looking at equity. We have waxed eloquent at the fact that the average American consumes 17 times more energy than the average Indian. And therefore, the average American is responsible for 17 times the emissions of the average Indian. But the question is, who is this average Indian? And is not the urban Indian in Delhi consuming 10 times more energy than his brother in the rural areas? And should not the urban Indian then take a greater responsibility for reducing emissions than the his rural counterpart? Where is this reflected in our INDCs? It is not. So, for example, we have talked a lot about generating electricity, but we have not spoken in the INDC about who this electricity is for. We have made the usual statement. This government has also said, we will provide electricity for all by 2022. Forgive me for being skeptical, but I have heard this for the last 15 years. Every government in every 5-year plan has come and said, we will do electricity for all in the next 5 years. We are nowhere near that scenario. If you remember, about a few months ago, the Prime Minister in one of his radio talks, Man Ki Baat talks, named a particular village in UP, which he said did not have electricity, and now it does, and how the villagers are so happy. Some bright spark in the newspaper went and visited that village and found there was no electricity there. Which just goes to show that there is a huge gap between the promise and the reality. So when government speaks, it speaks about village electrification. But if a village gets electrified, it doesn't mean households in that village get electrified. There will be a pole in that village, a wire is coming to that pole, and that's it. From the pole, there are no wires going to the households giving them. So on paper, 92% of India's villages are electrified, but only 54% of households get electricity in this country. And when they get electricity, they may get it for 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day. They may get voltage at 140 when tube lights will not light up. So quality of electricity is something I'm not even speaking of yet. But India has just signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the big gap areas in the Millennium Development Goals was energy access was not one of the MDGs. Energy access is one of the goals in the SDGs. And a big campaign was led by many organizations, civil society groups world over to make sure energy is included. It is now. India is on board. We are a signatory, and we need to hold the government's feet to the fire in terms of this promise that the Indian government has made. The issue is, we all talk about trickle-down economics, and we know that GDP growth does not translate into poverty removal, because we say trickle-down economics does not work. Similarly, trickle-down energy will not work either. If I produce more electricity, it will just get consumed by those who already have more electricity. People who have one air conditioner will buy 2 air conditioners, people who have 2 will buy a third one, and so on. It will not reach the have-nots, the electricity have-nots, unless you make special efforts. And I wish the INDC had spoken about what the government proposes to do to actually, because that would have then strengthened your argument internationally, saying, this is the argument that India has been saying abroad, we need to develop, we need to eradicate poverty. That's why our emissions are likely to go. But where is that evidenced in the INDC that we have put up? It is not. Buildings, the other area. We know we have green building codes. I believe there is one right here on our
IP is
yeah.
Shamirpet campus is green building.
Right, a green building. We have several such green buildings. You have a building code now. It's called ECBC, Energy Conservation Building Code. But these building codes are for commercial and office buildings with more than 20,000 square meters of area, which consume at least 100 kilowatts of load. Those green building codes are there, but in the residential sector, there are no norms. So houses are being built, multi-storied apartments are being built, and those of us who have visited any of these new apartments, particularly in my neighborhood in Gurgaon, they're all high-rise steel and glass and concrete structures which consume huge amounts of electricity in summer. It's the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be building with different materials, using hollow bricks and blocks and so on to reduce the electricity load. We have made no rules for this. I just wanted you to note that estimates are that 50 to 70% more housing, the total housing load that India is going to have by the year 2050, 50 to 70% of that is still to be built. So this is a great opportunity. If we don't take this opportunity now, we have locked in that much carbon for the next 50 years. This is a time to intervene. I was fortunately or unfortunately a member of the previous government's planning commission, had set up a committee called the Committee Expert Group on Low Carbon Inclusive Development to meet the Copenhagen Agreement. This was one of the first demands civil society groups like ours put forward. It was flatly ruled out by the government. They said, don't touch the building sector because the building sector is an engine of growth of the Indian economy. Haath mat lagao. Big opportunity has been missed and continues to be missed even today. My argument still remains. If a house buyer can spend 40 lakhs to buy a flat, he can also pay 43 lakhs. It won't make much difference to the EMI that he gives, if that's the extra that it's going to cost to make it. So once again, here's an opportunity where the better off could have taken more of the burden of reducing energy and therefore emissions, but we have not done so in our INDCs. The forest and green cover I've already talked to you about. We already know that there is an ongoing problem of rapid diversion of forests for industrial activities, for mining, for development, for urban expansion, and so on. In light of that, what are we going to do? INDC talks of the green highways project. So you build highways and you line them with trees on either side. And this is supposed to compensate for the forests that you have, which clearly it does not. Please remember, forest areas which are being denuded today support directly and indirectly the livelihoods and support systems for close to 250 million people in India who live in or on the fringes of the forest. It's a deep blow to equity which is currently going on and which the INDC takes no measure to address. In fact, looks at it the other way. Transport, I've already spoken of, no role given for rail passenger share. On the other hand, metros are being expanded even in cities which may not be able to afford metros. No mention is made of bus transportation. Even state capitals in India don't have bus transportation, which is badly needed in this. Aviation is being given a boost. You've seen the recent announcement of regional connectivity and so on. A bullet train has been promised in the Mumbai, Ahmedabad and Delhi, Varanasi sectors. So there is no effort at looking at transportation as a whole. Look at air, road, rail, rationalize these, look at what's the benefit for the common man, what's the benefit for mitigation, and what is the cost involved, and rationalize between them. No effort to do so. Again, there is a big emphasis on biofuels, and an aspirational target has been set of 20% biofuel blending. India has not yet been able to achieve 10% blending for petrol by ethanol. We have hardly achieved 5%. INDC talks of 20%, which can only be done by dedicating more land to grow fuel rather than land to grow food. And once again, I believe this is an anti-equity measure in the INDCs. As I said, I think the INDC was a great opportunity to rethink our development trajectory, look at development holistically, what do we want to achieve, and simultaneously target mitigation, reduction of carbon, economic growth, equity, that is to promote energy access among the have-nots, to local environment and health, to promote all these simultaneously rather than, as the INDC does, just look at mitigation, reduction of carbon dioxide as a goal. It doesn't matter whether we achieve that at the cost of equity or the cost of the poor or not. Focus is mainly, as I said, unidimensional and basically oriented towards mitigation, adopting a trickle-down approach to energy, just like a trickle-down approach in economics. So what I'm really arguing is, if you are looking at climate justice, I would argue that we are not just looking at a green vision. Just look at everything from an environmentalist or a carbon reduction point of view, but also look at a social justice dimension to this. Unless you combine environmental justice with social justice, you will not be able to achieve the goals that we are all looking for. Thank you. I'm going to stop there.